My next step now would be to go back to a filbert brush, small filbert or medium filbert, and strike in these trees through the wet paint. So we'll go for something along the lines of a, probably about a number 6, number 6 or thereabouts. Now the beauty of the filbert is that we've got this lovely rounded edge, which is wonderful for soft strokes. We've got this great slicing cutting edge here, which is wonderful for edges and for striking in trees such as this. So I'm just going to take a little bit of the darker brown and I'm just going to shape those trees in. Now you'll notice the loaded side of the brush I'm keeping to the shadow side. Now this will have reflected light on it later, so I need to just remember that that has to be taken into consideration. We can lose a bit of foliage around these. Remember, this is only early stages. Branches come out at nodal points. Now this is a nodal point where the tree changes direction, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, and the tree doesn't sort of grow naturally or doesn't look natural. So remember nodal points, and remember to zigzag your tree a little bit. Straight trees, rather like the river, are not all that appealing and they don't look all that natural. Cut some branches back across your tree, and I'll move to a smaller brush in a moment, but you're probably getting the feeling for where this is going. Fairly easy stuff? No problem. Reflections, just to remind me to put them back in, and we'll clean those up at a later stage. So what I'll do now is to swap to a small sable brush, a liner brush, whatever it is that you particularly like, using upward strokes wherever possible, and I'm sorry if I'm across the camera here. We just run these strokes in. Because we're working wet in wet, the paint is going to be broken down very quickly. So we're going to get the two colours mixing, and we will have to go back in when it's dry and do it. When we're out in the field, we use different techniques which enable us to do this by using a very fast drying solvent on this background, such as gum turps or whatever, and it means we can draw more or less dry brush work over it without creating a problem. Now you'll notice that I'm using the old favourite filbert with all its raggy, daggy bits hanging off it. Bit of middle foliage grey with some red mixed with it, and just trying to get that soft area. This is called patting. The technique we were using in here I refer to as stippling, and this technique is very, very useful to create sort of more random looking effects. I'm rolling the brush backwards and forwards here to create this illusion of almost leafy patterns. Creating foliage bracts. Trees grow with bracts, so the branches actually carry the foliage in groups, and it's worthwhile actually getting reference material for trees, and I'll refer to that a little bit more fully when we get onto the big tree here shortly, because without reference, without seeing the real thing, it's almost impossible to do a believable tree, and that's what a lot of people have problems with because they don't have the good reference material. You'll notice that we've done a little bit of a sneaky on you here and completed some of the foliage that wasn't done before. Added a little bit of foreground foliage, basically the same technique as we used here, but a stronger value. Added a few little rocks. These are just little shaped in bits with a small flat brush, and we'll put highlights on those later and ripple them. But other than that, we haven't snuck anything on you too much. I'd just like to briefly mention the necessity for having good reference material. A lot of artists, particularly beginning artists, and I was guilty of the same thing, don't have good references, so we tend to make them up without really having anything to go by. Now trees are probably one of the most important things that we can have references for, because every gum, if we're painting gums, is such a unique and individual tree. Now these are just some of our local trees. As you can see, the colours and the shapes are quite spectacular, and there's much more colour in the landscape and in trees than most people imagine. Look at this wonderful old chap. You'd swear he'd fall over in a stiff breeze, but he's probably been there 100 years. Ready-made painting. So just thought we'd mention that, and I certainly refer to them as references myself still, because it's very hard to get genuine knot holes and the like, bark features, etc., without that reference. Okay, back to the brush. I'm going to work on the large tree trunk now, and we need to create some degree of roundness. There's a number of things we can do with these. We can actually have the light coming this way a little more and edge light it, or we can have it coming across this way and have the light coming around more. I think I would rather have the light coming around more, so we'll have it coming more or less transversely across the painting. So we just need a filbert brush, and we're just going to shape this thing in now using various colours and values. So we're going to start with the shadow values. Now these, once again, will lie most strongly towards the back edge. So I'm just going to shape this in. Edge of the filbert brush loaded. In fact, there's a bit too much red on that. I'll just knock that back a bit. Avoid the temptation when you're doing this to just paint in one shadow value and leave it at that. This is purely a tonal step that I'm doing here. You'll notice there's more shadow as the diameter of the tree gets larger, and that shadow will then be on the underside of the bigger branches and on the back side here away from the light. So this actually helps us to get some form into what we're doing. It's very rough and intended to be very rough. Now, as we work towards the light, obviously the values have to become lighter. I'm going to use the light colours we have here, which are the soft sort of yellowy orangey colours. So I'd look for a complementary opposite colour, which is going to be into the blues and probably the blue violets if we're going to have yellow in it. That's being on the opposite side of the wheel. So I'm going to now swing that over, grey it off a little bit. I'm just going to brush a bit of this in here. Allow it to blend lightly. Now remember, these are just the preliminary undercolours. Gumtree's got many more colours than I've got in it at the moment. And one of the big mistakes that we all make at some point in our career is to think that we can paint very simply and create a believable effect. Well, it's not quite always that way. Not unless you're a modern painter, in which case you're looking at a very different set of parameters and a different result, of course, particularly if they're doing abstract and they're trying to reduce it down to a bare minimum, whereas we're not. We're trying to create an illusion of reality. Even if it's impressionistically done, it still has to have some believability. So, all a bit grey at the moment, that's all right. We might refer back to our reference tree in a moment and just have a look at the real colours in it. Now at this stage I would dive into the lighter colours that we were just referring to and begin by just shaping in a rough edge here. Once again, filbert brush loaded on one side, that side facing out towards the light where I want the colour to be strongest. And then just feather it in. I'm using slightly oblique crisscross strokes here so we get the illusion of broken colour, broken value, and enable that colour to work back into the blue violet we've just put on, and vice versa. So we're starting to get some semblance of roundness already, and there's still a lot more to go yet. Okay. A bit more down onto the upper part of the trunk. Now this will have cast shadows and things on it later on, but we'll let it dry before we get to that point. Otherwise we tend to create mud, remembering that we are using fairly non-toxic solvents, and because of that they don't dry very quickly, which makes them non-toxic. Okay, now I notice here I've got a bit of a problem. I've terminated two branches at the same point on the tree. Even though you do occasionally see this, it doesn't look right. So what I will do here is I'll simply drag this one down into the tree. Put a little branch in there, and we'll terminate him down in there. So we've now staggered these branch exit points so they don't look so odd. One of the big problems that I noticed a lot of beginners have is the rabbit ear or the antenna syndrome, where they don't know what to do at the top of the tree, so they simply break it into two and end up with these strange little V's or forks in the tree. Try and avoid that if you possibly can by staggering them in this manner. The tree's pretty clever, and it tends to stagger them anyway because the load then of that branch doesn't cause too much stress at a given point. Back once again, you'll notice we've sprouted a few limbs. We've had a lot of rain here and it has grown a lot. I just thought I'd pop those in. They're just rudimentary shapes at this point, and they'll be refined a lot later once the back paint dries. What I'm going to do now is one of the things that makes a tree really look quite spectacular, and that's adding the bark and the mottling and the lumps and bumps and warts on it. Once again, because it's wet paint, we can only do so much with it, but bear with me and we'll see a marvellous transformation take place. So this is the boot of the tree, obviously because it's at the bottom. And I'm just using a palette knife now, just a small blade, and loading it up and working initially in an upward direction, and then later sort of just feathering edges out where necessary. Gives us very clean colour. The temptation for some people, of course, is to apply it too much and then you're in trouble. And I'm going to use a slight barber pole effect on it. That is, the tree actually rolls around like so with its bark effects. Just feathering it out with the knife held pretty flat in some areas, up on its edge where I want to get a sharp edge. Remembering that this is still all wet in wet, so we really aren't going to get anywhere near the finished result at this point. There's a nice little warty lump on it, and we just feather that back in so it doesn't sit there like a pimple on a pumpkin, quite literally. Soften this back in. Bark will tend to accumulate in these little forks.